The secrets of childhood often hide behind closed doors, but for Ethan and Lily Carter, they played out in plain sight, in an empty house on Maple Street. In a modest two-story house on Maple Street, 9-year-old Ethan Carter sat by the living room window, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty driveway. His younger sister Lily, just 7, was curled up on the couch behind him, her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her small arms. The house around them felt too big, too quiet, save for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, were exactly where they always were at this hour at work. Mr. Carter, with his pressed suits and polished briefcase, spent his days at the city's most prestigious law firm. The morning routine was always the same: a quick ruffle of Ethan's hair, a peck on Lily's forehead, and the familiar jingle of car keys as he rushed out the door before the sun had fully risen. Mrs. Carter, equally ambitious in her role as a senior marketing executive, typically left even earlier. She would leave perfectly portioned breakfast plates in the refrigerator, complete with sticky notes bearing careful instructions: microwave for 2 minutes or don't forget your vitamins. Her love came in the form of meticulous preparation, even if her presence was marked more by absence than attendance. The Carter children had developed their own daily rhythm in this solitude. Ethan, trying his best to be the responsible older brother, would make sure they both got ready for school on time. He'd help Lily tie her shoelaces, double-check that their homework was packed, and ensure the house was locked before they walked to the bus stop. After school, they'd return to their empty house, using the spare key hidden beneath the garden gnome. Some days, Lily would pretend their parents were just in the next room, carrying on imaginary conversations with their mother about her day at school, or asking their father to look at her latest artwork. Ethan would play along, though his eyes often drifted to the family photos on the wall, snapshots of happier, more together times that seemed to belong to a different family altogether. The neighbors knew the situation but kept their concerns to whispers over garden fences. Such sweet children, they'd say, but so often alone. The Carters were well respected in the community. Their absence was justified by the demands of building successful careers and providing a comfortable life for their children. As evening approached, Ethan and Lily would heat up the dinner their mother had prepared the weekend before, eating in front of the television that had become both babysitter and companion. They'd grown accustomed to this routine, but acceptance didn't make the loneliness any less palpable. The house felt biggest during these quiet dinners, when the clink of their forks against plates echoed through empty rooms. They were children playing at being adults, keeping up appearances of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. Yet beneath their practiced independence lay the simple wish of all children to have their parents present, not just providing, but there to share in the small moments that made up their daily lives. The night everything changed. The clock had just struck 10, well past their usual bedtime, but with no parents to enforce the rules, Ethan and Lily remained awake. The soft glow of the television painted their faces in shifting colors as they flipped through channels, searching for something to fill the silence of their empty house. Ethan's thumb paused on the remote as unfamiliar sounds caught his attention. The late-night program that filled the screen was unlike their usual cartoons or family shows. There were adults laughing, music pulsing, and scenes that moved quickly, too quickly for their young minds to fully process, yet somehow magnetic in their mystery. "What are they doing?" Lily whispered, scooting closer to her brother on the couch. Her small face scrunched in confusion as she watched the screen, trying to make sense of the adult world being displayed before her innocent eyes. The content was beyond their understanding, yet they couldn't look away, mesmerized by the forbidden nature of what they were witnessing. "I think it's something grown-ups do," Ethan replied, his voice carrying a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. Neither child fully comprehended what they were seeing, but they knew instinctively that it was different from their normal programming. The scenes continued to play, planting seeds of confusion and curiosity in their developing minds. In a house with proper supervision, this moment would have ended differently. A parent would have appeared, quickly changing the channel and using the opportunity to have an age-appropriate discussion about what they'd seen. But in the Carter household, there was no one to guide them through this moment, no one to help them process or understand. The program continued, its content becoming increasingly inappropriate for young viewers. Lily hugged her knees to her chest, feeling uncomfortable but not knowing why. Ethan sat transfixed, his 9-year-old mind trying to piece together the puzzle of adult behavior he was witnessing. Minutes stretched into an hour as they watched, neither child knowing how to handle what they were seeing. The usual sounds of their home, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the hallway clock, seemed to fade away, leaving only the television's glow and the dangerous knowledge it was imparting. When they finally went to bed that night, long after they should have been asleep, the images from the television followed them. Lily pulled her blankets up to her chin, trying to push away the confusing feelings the show had stirred. Ethan lay awake, his mind replaying scenes he was too young to understand. In the days that followed, neither child mentioned what they'd seen to their parents during their brief morning interactions. Mrs. Carter, rushing to prepare for another busy day, didn't notice the slight changes in her children's behavior. Mr. Carter, buried in his legal briefs, missed the meaningful glances exchanged between his son and daughter. The television had become more than just a babysitter. It had become a dangerous window into an adult world, one that their young minds weren't ready to explore. And in their solitude, with no adult guidance to help them navigate these waters, the seeds of curiosity began to grow into something more troubling. The television had become more than just a babysitter. It had become a dangerous window into an adult world, one that their young minds weren't ready to explore. And in their solitude, with no adult guidance to help them navigate these waters, the seeds of curiosity began to grow into something more troubling. Days passed like shadows across the Carter household, but the images from that late-night television show had carved a permanent space in Ethan's thoughts. Something had shifted in the dynamic between the siblings, like a door opened that couldn't quite be closed again. One quiet afternoon, while sunlight streamed through the living room windows, Ethan approached his sister with an unsettling gleam in his eyes. "Lily," he whispered, "remember what we saw on TV?" His voice carried a mixture of childish excitement and something darker, something that shouldn't exist in a 9-year-old's world. Lily felt her stomach tighten at his words. She focused intently on her coloring book, pressing her crayon so hard it nearly tore through the page. "I don't want to talk about it," she mumbled, but Ethan persisted. "We could try it," he suggested, unaware of the weight his words carried. Like a game, when Lily shook her head, Ethan's voice took on an edge she'd never heard before. "If you don't, I'll tell Dad about the time you went outside when we weren't supposed to." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Lily's hand trembled, her crayon creating jagged lines across her once perfect picture. She felt trapped, caught between her brother's insistence and her own growing discomfort. The safe haven of their sibling relationship was crumbling, replaced by something that made her want to hide. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Carter made a rare appearance at home, rushing in to grab some forgotten documents. Lily saw her chance. Her small feet carried her to the kitchen, where her mother was hurriedly shuffling through papers. "Mum," Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Can I talk to you? It's important." Mrs. Carter barely glanced up from her papers, her phone pressed between her ear and shoulder. "Not now, sweetie. I'm already late for my meeting." She continued her conversation on the phone, gathering her things with practiced efficiency. "But Mom," Lily tried again, her voice cracking. Tears welled up in her eyes as she watched her mother move through the kitchen like a whirlwind, present but unreachable. "Later, darling," Mrs. Carter called over her shoulder, already heading for the door. "Be a good girl." All right. The door closed behind her with a final click, leaving Lily standing alone in the kitchen, her unspoken words heavy on her tongue. In her room that evening, Lily hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. The weight of her secret pressed down on her like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. She couldn't understand why her brother was different now, why their games had turned into something that scared her, or why the adults who were supposed to protect her seemed so far away. The house felt bigger than ever, filled with shadows that seemed to grow longer with each passing day. And in the silence of her room, Lily realized that being alone wasn't just about empty rooms anymore. It was about having no one to hear you when you needed to speak the most. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Lily stood trembling on Aunt Grace's front porch. She wasn't really their aunt, just a kind neighbor who had lived next door to the Carters for years, but she had always felt like family. With tears streaming down her face and her small hands shaking, Lily pressed the doorbell. Aunt Grace opened the door, her warm smile quickly fading as she took in the distressed child before her. "Lily, sweetheart, what's wrong?" She knelt down, meeting the little girl at eye level. The concern in her voice was genuine, something Lily hadn't heard in what felt like forever. Through hiccuping sobs, Lily began to share her fears and worries. Aunt Grace listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each word. She guided Lily to her cozy kitchen, where the smell of fresh baked cookies and the gentle ticking of an old wall clock created a sense of safety that had been missing from Lily's life. "You did the right thing coming to me," Aunt Grace assured her, pushing a mug of hot chocolate across the table. Sometimes being brave means asking for help. She reached out and squeezed Lily's small hand, providing the comfort of human connection that the child so desperately needed. The next few hours unfolded like a delicate operation. Aunt Grace made several phone calls, her voice firm but kind as she spoke to the necessary authorities. She stayed with Lily, making sure the child felt protected and heard throughout the process. When Mr. and Mrs. Carter arrived, summoned by urgent calls from Aunt Grace, their reactions played out like a well-worn script of denial. "There must be some misunderstanding," Mrs. Carter insisted, her professional facade cracking slightly under the weight of the situation. Mr. Carter stood by the window, his back rigid with disbelief. "Listen to me," Aunt Grace said firmly, her usually gentle voice taking on a steel edge. "Your children have been trying to tell you something important. The question isn't whether this happened, it's what you're going to do about it now." The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the kitchen clock. Mrs. Carter sank into a chair, her carefully constructed world of career success and perceived perfect parenting beginning to crumble. Mr. Carter finally turned from the window, his face showing the first signs of understanding the gravity of the situation. Lily sat quietly through it all, still holding her hot chocolate, watching the adults in her life finally begin to acknowledge what she had been trying to tell them. Aunt Grace kept a protective hand on her shoulder, a steady presence in the storm of emotions swirling through the kitchen. "We need to make some changes," Aunt Grace continued, her voice softening but remaining firm. "Real changes. These children need you, not just your provisions but your presence." As the afternoon light faded into evening, plans began to take shape in Aunt Grace's kitchen. While the path forward wouldn't be easy, the first step had been taken. Someone had finally listened to a child's cry for help. The path to healing. The Carters' living room, once a symbol of their children's isolation, began its transformation on a Sunday afternoon. Mr. Carter sat at the dining table, his laptop open not to legal briefs but to research on child development and family counseling. Mrs. Carter, who had taken a step back from her executive role, was installing parental controls on every device in the house. "We've been so blind," Mrs. Carter whispered, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the TV settings. The same screen that had caused so much harm would now be strictly monitored, with programs carefully selected for age-appropriate content. The late-night channels were blocked, and a timer would ensure the television remained off after certain hours. Their first family counseling session was scheduled for Tuesday afternoons, a time slot Mrs. Carter had previously reserved for board meetings. The children sat nervously in Dr. Thompson's warm office, surrounded by soft colors and gentle lighting. The therapist's kind eyes and patient demeanor helped ease their anxiety. "Healing takes time," Dr. Thompson explained to the family, "but acknowledging the problem is the first step toward recovery." She worked with each family member individually and then brought them together, helping them rebuild the trust that had been fractured. Mr. Carter made the bold decision to transfer to a different department at his law firm, one that allowed him to work from home 3 days a week. His colleagues were surprised, but for the first time in years he felt he was making the right choice. The sound of his children's laughter during lunch breaks became more valuable than any courtroom victory. The family started having dinner together every evening, a simple change that felt monumental in its impact. The dining room table, once a lonely spot for hurried solo meals, became a place of connection. They shared stories about their days, discussed their feelings, and slowly learned to trust one another again. Weekends transformed into sacred family time. Board games replaced solitary screen time, and family outings became regular events. Mrs. Carter discovered she had a talent for organizing scavenger hunts in the backyard, while Mr. Carter revealed a hidden gift for storytelling during their new bedtime routine. The healing wasn't always smooth. There were difficult conversations, tears, and moments of frustration, but with each passing week, the atmosphere in the Carter home grew lighter. Lily's nightmares became less frequent, and Ethan's behavior showed marked improvement under the guidance of their counselor. One evening, as Mrs. Carter tucked Lily into bed, something she now did every night without fail, her daughter looked up at her with clear eyes. "Mummy, I'm glad you're here now," Lily said softly. The words were simple but carried the weight of everything they'd been through. Mrs. Carter felt tears welling up as she hugged her daughter. "I'm glad too, sweetheart. I'm so glad too." She lingered in the doorway after turning out the light, watching her daughter's peaceful sleep, a sight she'd missed too many times before. The career accolades she'd once chased seemed hollow compared to these precious moments with her children. The house on Maple Street was finally becoming a true home. A new beginning. Spring bloomed on Maple Street, and with it, the Carter family blossomed into something new and beautiful. The house that had once felt too big and empty now buzzed with life and laughter. Through open windows, neighbors could hear the sounds of family game nights, shared stories, and genuine connection. One Saturday morning, Ethan and Lily sat together in their backyard treehouse, a weekend project Mr. Carter had built with them. Their interactions had transformed from the darkness of those troubled days into something bright and innocent again. They were just siblings now, sharing comic books and trading sandwich halves at lunch. "Look, I drew us," Lily said, holding up a crayon drawing of 4 stick figures holding hands. The picture showed their family, complete with bright smiles and hearts floating above their heads. Ethan grinned, pointing at his stick figure wearing a cape. Their artwork now covered the refrigerator door, a gallery of healing displayed in childhood masterpieces. Mrs. Carter watched from the kitchen window as her children played. The guilt of her past absence still lingered, but it was gradually being replaced by the joy of present moments. She'd learned to recognize the subtle signs in her children's behavior: when they needed to talk, when they needed space, when they needed an extra hug. Family dinner had become a cherished ritual. Each person took turns sharing their rose and thorn, the best and hardest parts of their day. Through these conversations, trust rebuilt itself brick by brick. Lily no longer hesitated to share her worries, and Ethan had learned to express his feelings through words rather than actions. "My rose today," Lily announced one evening, "is that Mom was there when I woke up from my bad dream last night." Mrs. Carter reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand, remembering the midnight conversation they'd shared, grateful she'd been there to provide comfort. The changes in their home were both subtle and profound. Child locks secured inappropriate channels, but more importantly, open discussions about media content became normal. The children knew they could ask questions about anything they saw or heard, and their parents would provide age-appropriate answers. Mr. Carter, once buried in legal briefs during evenings, now led Daddy Adventure Time after dinner. These precious hours involved everything from pillow fort construction to backyard astronomy lessons. His colleagues noticed the change in him too. He walked taller, smiled more, spoke of his family with pride rather than distraction. The siblings' relationship healed in its own special way. The Carter home had become what it always should have been: a sanctuary where children felt protected, heard, and most importantly, cherished. Their shared trauma transformed into shared recovery, creating a bond deeper than before. Ethan had become protective in a healthy way, looking out for his sister on the playground, helping her with homework, being the big brother she needed. One evening, as the family sat together in their living room, each engaged in their own activity, but together in the same space, Lily looked around at her family and smiled. The house felt different now, warmer, safer, filled with love and attention rather than emptiness and confusion. Lessons from Maple Street. Years later, Mrs. Carter would often pause by the family photos that lined their hallway. The images told a story of transformation, from the older pictures where smiles seemed forced and distant, to the newer ones filled with genuine joy and connection. Each frame held a lesson learned at great cost. One particular photo caught her eye, a candid shot of Lily whispering something to her at the breakfast table, her own face turned toward her daughter with complete attention. It was such a simple moment, yet it represented everything they'd learned about the profound importance of truly being present. The smallest moments matter most, Mrs. Carter often shared with other parents at school meetings. It's not about the grand gestures or expensive gifts. It's about being there when your child looks up from their drawing to show you their work. It's about listening when they tell you about their day, even if you've had the longest day yourself. Mr. Carter, too, had become an advocate for change in his own way. At his law firm, he started an initiative encouraging work-life balance for parents. Success, he would say during firm meetings, isn't measured by billable hours, but by the moments we don't miss in our children's lives. The Carters learned that supervision went beyond merely being in the same house. It meant being actively involved in their children's world, knowing what they watched, understanding who their friends were, and creating an environment where questions were welcomed and answered honestly. Perhaps the most powerful lesson came from Lily herself. Her courage in seeking help from Aunt Grace had taught them all that strength sometimes means asking for support. The family now kept an open-door policy with their children's friends, becoming a safe haven where kids knew they could speak up about anything troubling them. During one of their family therapy sessions, Dr. Thompson had said something that stuck with them: children speak in whispers before they scream. The key is learning to listen for the whispers. This wisdom became a guiding principle in their home, where no concern was too small to be heard. The changes in their family rippled outward into their community. Other parents began to notice the transformation in the Carter children, how they carried themselves with newfound confidence, how they looked adults in the eye when speaking, how they stood up for friends who needed help. One evening, as the family sat together during their regular family council meeting, a practice they started to ensure everyone's voice was heard, Lily shared something profound in her simple, childlike way. "I used to think being loved meant getting lots of presents," she said, playing with the charm bracelet on her wrist. "But now I know it means being heard." Ethan nodded in agreement, adding, "And knowing someone will always be there when you need them." Mrs. Carter caught her husband's eye across the room, both of them understanding the weight of their children's words. The most valuable gift they could give their children wasn't found in their successful careers or material provisions. It was in the simple act of being present, listening, and creating a safe space where their children could grow and thrive. The story of the Carter family became a testament to the power of attention, presence, and the courage to change.